Thanks, Elena. Thanks, listeners and panelists alike. Let's start with Q&A. You'll have up to 1 minute to introduce yourself if you'd like, and also ask your question. Your question can be targeted to the entire panel or to a specific panelist. And we'll take Sasha first, and we'll put Somia on deck. So Sasha, please go ahead. You have 1 minute.
Hi, my name is Sasha. Professionally, I do a lot of search engine optimization. So obviously my life is fighting against, the Web 2, Web 2 algorithms. A lot of my customers use Shopify, and it's easy for them because of the stack. Can you guys kind of talk about a Web3 feature of Shopify and how far away you guys think that something like Shopify Web3, where all the things that Shopify kind of does for you, how long that's going to take for, a bodega owner or somebody, a layperson, to be able to kind of set up a Shopify type infrastructure to be able to sell their digital goods or physical goods, right? But they have the digital infrastructure live on Web3 platforms instead of AWS and all those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha.
Yes, this is a bit of a weird one, because delving into the specifics of payments and management of like user management and payments and all of this, Shopify does a lot that is catered towards you running a traditional, business, right? And a lot of stuff in the Web3 space doesn't fit that model as well. And I think getting to really easy payment APIs is something that's happening. We're moving towards that pretty quickly. But I think the thing that replaces Shopify is going to look different than Shopify for sure.
I think probably we're closest to that area. I agree with the point made about payment gateways still needing work, but getting there. I think we're tackling, the things needed around having catalogs and the SEO type issues. I mean, a lot of that's the website, but building your catalog and stock management, that's all traditional database things. From our point of view, I mean, we're launching first quarter next year publicly. We have private alphas out now. We have people building on it now in, pretty difficult areas like health management and legal services. But, building a front end like Shopify, they've done a lot of work to get that really optimized. You could sort of see some things happening next year, over the next 12 months to get to some kind of level of that. But there's an awful lot of work that's done to build beautiful applications like Shopify for the front end and integration with accounting systems and all those things. So a lot to do, but great opportunities.
Thank you all. Let's move on to Somia, and then Angela, you're on deck.
Hey, thank you so much for hosting this Twitter space. I want to thank the panelists and for giving us an opportunity to share our opinions. I'm actually a PhD student in political science at Duke, and I'm increasingly interested in blockchain. I think blockchain is fascinating, but I also think that there can be kind of a challenge between like what we think of blockchain as the ideal, and then like how it's actually like applied in practice. And so my question here is about like what defines a bad actor, and like forgive me if this is like a naive question, like there might be some sort of standard that I'm not aware of. Like how does, because I think it could be the case where something can look malicious or appear malicious, but it doesn't actually mean that action has caused harm, and vice versa. There could be a situation where there's harm that's being caused, but it's regardless of whether it's intentional or not, it could just be all sorts of different like things that we don't necessarily know about. So if you could speak to that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And from the perspective of decentralization in the blockchain space, like a quote unquote bad actor is anyone that can influence your world where you are the user in a way that you don't want. And so in Bitcoin, a bad actor is like someone who can spend money that they didn't earn. And that, that's just a rule that got set up. Or like in decentralized data, if someone can prevent me from sending a message to my friend, because me and my friend are both consenting to that message, a bad actor is anyone who can get in the middle of that. And so it is this like extremely relative thing where the way that different communities might define bad actors is going to be very different. And if you have true decentralization, both of those communities are going to be able to have those different definitions at the same time and enforce rules to filter out bad actors in very different ways. And the key is that those rules only apply within those certain spheres. So I think, decentralization is really about building small spheres where the rules are different from sphere to sphere, and then figuring out how to enforce the rules you want within your own sphere.
Yeah, I mean, I think totally agree with what David said there. The general thing is like a bad actor is really more subjectively defined here. Either it's strictly against, the rules of the system that as the system was designed, or it's up to, individual users to decide what they consider bad and, take action to protect themselves in that. Like in the case of, decentralized data storage, say you're a storage provider, a bad actor could potentially be one that is storing data with you that you don't want to be stored. So, bad bits that are being stored. So a bad actor, in that case would be one that you effectively don't want storing data with you.
I think one thing that people often neglect to mention here is externalities. So things like that impact people outside their in-group. I don't know what the solution is there, but you do see this type of thing discussed around things like Bitcoin mining and have the environmental impact of that. There's a lot of positives and negatives there because a lot of people doing renewable energy projects that are funded by Bitcoin mining because it's this big blob of energy usage that lets them set up solar farms. But there are external factors there that aren't built into the token. So that's something that often gets left out of these discussions. I don't know how to bring that in more, but I think it's something that does need to get considered.
Great responses. I hope that answers your question. So Mia, naive questions are great. And we'll move on to Angela, and then Dan York will be on deck. Go ahead, Angela.
Hi, Angela. I am an engineer and have been working in Web3 for a little while now, and am working on some DAO stuff. And like many of you have said, the difficult part seems to be figuring out a governance system, which is not 100% maybe meritocracy based, but has a decent mix of both reputation and tokens. I don't know if you have seen Colony and what they're doing over there on XDAI, but I would be curious to know if there are any other tools that you guys know of that are similar to that for tracking reputation or setting up DAOs that have the ability to be flexible in managing governance. Yeah, it's a difficult space. So thanks.
Yeah,
I think from the silence, I think from the silence, I think everyone acknowledges that it is a really difficult problem. I don't really have anything to offer in that, but I think it's a good thing for people to tackle. We are interested in the governance space, community management. We have an identity layer built around decentralized IDs. We see that as a key thing around being able to send messages to community participants from the DAO. But beyond that, it's a hard one.
Yeah,
I think part of the challenge. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's definitely a lot around reputation management and tracking. Like a lot of people tend to chalk up some of these problems to oh, we'll build just, reputation networks and trust webs and, have, like people just say, oh, we'll just solve it with a web of trust. And that historically has been either really hard or not worked in practice yet. And so I think like the point you bring up is tooling for this is absolutely necessary. People should be building this. And like the basic like starter way I see towards this is people starting to build software that just allows them to build subjective lists of, their own opinions on, trustfulness of different groups or like, reputation of different groups. And then from there move towards ways of sharing that and, utilizing that as a community. But I don't know of anything existing in the space yet.
I think part of the challenge of answering governance questions is that a lot of times they're just, it's not specifying exactly what is being governed, because I think that the answer for like the best governance is going to be different depending on, are you governing the rules of the protocol? Are you governing what tweets show up in your feed? Are you governing who's allowed to participate in a community? And I think all three of those things are very different, and the answers to each of them is going to look very different.
Thank you all, and thank you, Angela. We'll move on to Dan York, and from there, we'll put Andrew on deck.
Hi, thanks for this very interesting discussion and for having me. My name's Dan York. I've been working with the web since the early 1990s, and the original web was and still is massively decentralized. A concern I've had, I think was voiced earlier by Elena, the web took off in large part because it burst content out of the paid walled gardens that we had like CompuServe and AOL Prodigy, et cetera. It allowed anyone to publish content. The platforms really came about because they made it even easier. I feel like a lot of what I see with the web, with Web3 work, is that people keep focusing on adding a payment layer. But I guess my question is, how do we ensure we're keeping the web open to everyone and not just those who can pay?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that people hear paywall and they think like 25 cents to read an article, but when we're talking about paywalls here, and Nader kind of gave some numbers earlier, we're talking about things like $1 to read 1 million web pages. So this is sort of the thing where it's like, if you have an internet connection, you can definitely afford to be on Web3. You can pay for the bandwidth and storage that's involved with participating in Web3. And so these payment mechanisms are really not material barriers in most cases. I mean, if you're streaming 4K video 12 hours a day, that's going to run up a bill. But if you can't afford that, then just step down to like a standard definition, and suddenly you can probably do 24/7 streaming for much less than the cost of your ISP bill every month.
I'll talk about that a little bit too. I also was on the web in the early and mid-90s. I had a GeoCities page, and if you go through the archive, you'll probably find it somewhere. But I think one thing around the payment layer, I agree that there are equity issues, but I think that it makes it more explicit what value exchange is going on. A lot of the free services were free to users because there are advertisers paying, and now people are looking at the harm that causes and want alternatives. I don't think that making that explicit is a bad thing. I think that there needs to be ways to make it equitable, and that people who don't have either the money to pay for it or need to be able to get access without having the payment rails to get the money onto the network, how they get access to it. I think there are problems that need to be tackled, but I think that the explicit nature of saying I'm paying for this particular service because I value it, as opposed to relying on an advertiser paying for you, I think that's a really important step forward, not a step backwards.
And to be clear, I agree with that on the one point, but I think a challenge is that there's about a third of the world now that is still not connected, and there's a significant chunk of the people who have only recently become connected that are in places where the finances just aren't there. So a lot of those people, a lot of the people in regions of the world that have limited connectivity,
yep,
been able to make their voices be heard through various different publishing mechanisms that the web of today has enabled. And yes, some of those will wind up being advertising based, but they're voice
Look, yeah, look, I agree with that entirely.
Yeah.
A bunch of our developers are based in Africa, so we are very, very familiar with this. But I also think that people underestimate the access that even poor people have. You know, mobile phone penetration is huge in a lot of these areas, and we believe that anyone that can pay for a mobile phone, there's no reason why that should just be payment for the mobile phone network. There should be the people that are providing the value on that network get some of the money too. Now, that doesn't have to be a lot, but there's no reason that can't be something. And of course, it's very different for someone in a poor country to someone in a rich Western country. I don't know how to deal with that, and you know, I acknowledge that completely. But I do think that people, you know, the mobile phone systems in those countries work through payments. I know a lot of it's shared, but it doesn't mean that doesn't mean that people can't pay something at some point. But yeah, keep it equitable, keep it free for people who can't somehow.
Yeah, the pay per, you know, the paying for every individual piece of content thing, I'm still on the being skeptical of it point. You know, one, you're asking people in, say, okay, in order to do this, you have to set up a cryptocurrency wallet and go buy some tokens, and you know, like, okay, that's fine, assuming they do that. Beyond that, you now have these traceable payments between people, and now where did your privacy go? There's a lot of hard problems to be solved here before this is even a reasonable thing we should be proposing.
And the user experience is pretty bad at the moment too.
Well, so I would push back on that, because I think Skynet already has working solutions to these. Like the typical user experience for a Skynet user is not setting up a crypto wallet. You can just go and pay with Stripe. You can pay with your credit card, and then as you browse, the portal you're using is covering all the payments. You have this kind of provider model, but you're still effectively, you know, as you're browsing, it's the service providers are still receiving a pay as you go incentive scheme. So I do think a lot of the problems that you're bringing up are, like, we have working solutions that are, you know, have thousands of users on them.
Yeah, and we should mention Brave and now Opera, of course, both are in this area as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so Andrew, you're up. Thank you for your questions, Dan. And well, go ahead.
Thanks so much. I myself am just getting started in Web3, and I'm kind of looking to try to find or build a world where I can write I'm a data scientist, where I can write a SQL model and get paid every time someone uses it. So looking at incentivizing people to write powerful and like generalizable queries for Web3, so that analytics can be more incremental, like open source libraries are, instead of built from scratch inside each organization. In order to get someone to pay, I think that it has to be coupled with, decentralized storage and compute system. So I don't have to store any data or run the computation myself. And so then someone will decide to pay a small fee instead of, the alternative of building their own data warehouse and ETL and having the computation and storage. So how does decentralized storage work with database engines? Where could the database engine be running? And then what are the different models of data processing and transformation that are happening, whether on top of your platforms or whether they're built in? And I think that's it.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is my world. I come from big data, I guess is the name for it. The Vorick approaches, we use a database called CouchDB, which is, a fairly mature database, and the client version of that called Pouch, which runs on people's end clients, whether they be mobile phones or web browsers. And then you can run queries on that based on the CouchDB query language, which is a document store-based language. In terms of processing, they have these trigger-based processing type mechanisms that let you run that. So that's all off-chain. It runs on people's devices and gives you the performance that you need there. And then the sharing of the data is what we tokenize. And we have an encrypted layer to make sure that the synchronization through the central servers, those servers don't. No one in those servers can see the data. There's a lot. That's a base layer for your database query type infrastructure and the types of things that you're talking about. There's a lot of optimizations and things that need to happen beyond that. We have text search, but it's not your Lucerne based or Solr based type thing. There's a lot of things that need to be going on there, but it's a start. I think maybe Nader might want to talk a little bit about what the graph is doing on public data as well there. Perhaps we've lost him. Someone else.
I mean, I guess I can speak a little bit to it, but at least within the world of Skynet, the data model is just very different from anything you're used to. There is no central server, and there is no, the idea of running a query just has a very different shape. And so I think that's one of the challenges with onboarding developers, is getting them used to this like data Legos style of thing, where you don't have this like soup of all the answers in one spot. You do have to kind of build things in a very client centric way, and looking at each person providing their own piece of the puzzle. So, but I know the graph has more sophisticated answers to this, and then you also have things like Akash that can also provide a decentralized compute layer to help with some of the server side queries that a lot of people are familiar with using.
Angela, did you have another question for us?
I just wanted to make a quick comment about access because it was brought up, and I think it's really important. We started talking about access right off the bat in our DAOs. So I think you're going to have to actually just consider it, and every service is really going to have their own model for fair access. I mean, beyond the basics, of course, people still need access to mobile phones. But if people start in the very beginning considering scholarships or other ways for people to work their way into some of these systems with literally nothing, then we can all expect for it to be more fair, instead of trying to solve that problem after we realize it's not fair, because we know right now it's not going to be fair if we don't think about it from the beginning. So I think it's just a responsibility, just like we all have responsibility in society, for us to think deeply about how we can, continue some of the underlying ethos of Web3 in what we build.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I think subsidizing access is a good model. And even things that we see now that act as subsidies, although we don't think of them like that, things like airdrops are ways that people get access. And a lot of the people that get access through those mechanisms aren't necessarily the people that would be traditionally able to. But I entirely agree that it's something that needs to be thought about at the start. We think about it a lot, but don't have solutions. But scholarships and subsidies around that are pretty interesting ways of looking at it.
Yeah, I've been thinking recently that there might be some way of incentivizing through like the built-in mechanics of one of these networks, bringing in more people. So like this is obviously like not an easy thing and way far in the future, but if you had a way of incentivizing providing access to more people, building a system around that such that, new people coming to the system just get some way of interacting with it, for free at first. That, I think that would go a really long way towards, equalizing access to whatever we're building.
Thanks for your comment, Angela, and the responses. Any other comments or questions you'd like to ask? Please request to speak if so. Okay, we'd like to thank you all for your participation. Please do look out for our January session on moderation and reputation, which will be Thursday, January 27th at noontime, Pacific Standard Time. Also, we'll follow up with this recording on YouTube. Please also join the Discord. Again, thanks to all our panelists, Elena as well, the moderator. Have a great day. This is Robert Schwenker, signing off of Blockchain Incentivized Storage. Good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.